What if the answer to the oldest question in the Enoch tradition, what actually happened to the man who walked with God and was taken, is that he became God's throne? And what if that answer was considered so dangerous, so theologically explosive, that the text revealing it was buried for 1,500 years? Here is the paradox at the heart of today's video. The Third Book of Enoch is simultaneously the most radical piece of Jewish mystical literature ever written, and one of the least known documents in the entire history of religion. It describes human deification in terms so explicit, so anatomically precise, so cosmically total, that it makes Christian doctrine about the divine Christ look cautious by comparison. And it was written by Jews, preserved by Jews, hidden by Jews. Picture this. A rabbi named Ishmael ascends to the seventh heaven. He has passed through fire and wind and earthquake. He has moved through 6 celestial palaces, each guarded by angels of unimaginable power. And now, in the highest throne room of the cosmos, he is met by a being of such overwhelming radiance that he instinctively falls on his face. The being stands, and when it stands, Ishmael realizes it is taller than the distance between earth and the firmament. Its face is like the sun. Its robes are fire. Its eyes are torches of lightning. And then the being speaks. And it says something that will change everything Ishmael thought he understood about heaven, about humanity, about the distance between the two. I am Enoch, son of Jared. I am the one who was taken, and this is what I became. Today, we are going to follow the complete arc of the most audacious transformation in the history of religion. We are going to trace the journey of one man, a man who lived 7 generations after Adam, who was righteous in a wicked world, who walked with God in a way no one else had done, from that single cryptic verse in Genesis all the way to his final form, Metatron, the Prince of the Divine Presence, the lesser YHWH, the second throne of heaven. We are going to meet the rabbi whose encounter with that throne destroyed his faith and made him the most famous apostate in all of Jewish history. We are going to examine why this text, the culmination of a tradition stretching from the very first pages of the Bible, was suppressed, hidden, and kept from almost everyone. And we are going to sit with the question that the text itself forces on you, the question the rabbis could not answer and never stopped circling. What does it mean that a human being became God's throne? What does it mean that this is where the story of Enoch ends? Let's start at the beginning, not the beginning of the Third Book of Enoch, which is a late and sophisticated text, the beginning of Enoch himself, the beginning of the problem. Genesis 5 is one of those chapters that most readers skip. It is a genealogy, the line of Adam, father to son, each man living hundreds of years and then dying. And he died, and he died, and he died. The repetition is almost hypnotic in its relentlessness. Birth, fatherhood, years, death, the machinery of mortality grinding on. And then we reach Enoch, 7th in the line from Adam, and the text shifts. Enoch does not merely live. The text says he walks with God. It says this twice, and then it says something it is said about no one else. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 7 words in Hebrew, Vayethalech Hanoch et ha Elohim ve'einenu ki lakash oto Elohim. And he was not. God took him. He did not die. He was taken. Now, why does this matter? Why did these 7 words launch a tradition that would eventually produce one of the most theologically explosive documents in the ancient world. Because a gap in a text is an invitation. Because he was not is not an explanation. It is a mystery. Where did Enoch go? What was he taken for? What did walking with God mean so literally that it led to this? What happened to the man after he arrived wherever God took him? The ancient world could not leave this gap unfilled. And from the 3rd century BCE onward, a tradition of Enoch literature emerged. Text after text, filling in the silence of Genesis 5:24. 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, fragments, apocalypses, visions. And eventually, in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, the 3rd Book of Enoch. The answer, the full answer. But to understand what the 3rd Book of Enoch is doing, we need to understand what the earlier texts had already established. Because the 3rd book is not a standalone creation, it is a culmination. It is the final movement of a symphony that had been building for nearly 1,000 years. What did the tradition know about Enoch before the 3rd book was written? And what questions did it leave unanswered? The 1st Book of Enoch, sometimes called the Ethiopic Enoch, because it survives complete only in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia, is a vast, sprawling text. It includes some of the most important and strange material in ancient Judaism. Enoch ascends to heaven. He sees the throne of God. He witnesses the fate of the fallen angels, the watchers who came down and took human women and produced the Nephilim. He is shown the storehouses of winds and snow and hail. He receives apocalyptic visions of the end of days. He is a witness, a seer, a prophet who stands at the boundary between heaven and earth and mediates between the two. But, and this is critical, in 1st Enoch, Enoch is still a man, a glorified, elevated, cosmically significant man, but a man, a human figure who ascends and returns, who sees and reports back. He is not transformed. He is not remade. He does not become something other than what he was. The 2nd Book of Enoch, the Slavonic Enoch, pushes further. Enoch ascends through 7 heavens. He is stripped of his earthly garments and clothed in heavenly robes. He is anointed with a sweet fragrance. The oil that transforms him is described as shining more than great light, and his face begins to shine like the sun. In 2nd Enoch, the transformation is beginning, but it is still not complete. Enoch is still recognizably Enoch. He still returns to earth to deliver his message to his children. He is a transformed human, not a cosmic entity. Then there is silence. Several centuries of silence, or rather several centuries of hints and fragments, Talmudic references to a figure called Metatron, who sits beside God and serves as his celestial scribe and prince. References in texts like the Babylonian Talmud that seem to assume the reader already knows who Metatron is. References that are scattered, elusive, and occasionally anxious. And then, the 3rd Book of Enoch arrives, and it answers everything. But why was this text written when it was? What was happening in the 5th and 6th centuries that produced it? This is where the scholarly debates begin, and they are genuinely fascinating. The world that produced the 3rd Book of Enoch was the world of late antique Judaism, a world in which the temple had been destroyed for 400 years, in which the rabbis had become the dominant authority, in which Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and in which Jewish mysticism was both flourishing and under suspicion. The Hekhalot literature, the literature of the heavenly palaces, was the broader tradition within which 3 Enoch sits. Merkabah mysticism, the mysticism of the divine chariot, based on Ezekiel's vision of the throne of God, had been developing for centuries. Rabbis were ascending to heaven in visions, traversing the 7 palaces, standing before the throne. And 3 Enoch is, in one sense, the culmination and systematization of all of this, the text that puts it all together, that provides the narrative frame for all of the heavenly encounters, that answers the question that the tradition had been circling for 1,000 years. Enoch is Metatron. This is what the man became. This is the answer. And the answer changes everything. Let us enter the text. The third book of Enoch opens with Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, one of the great sages of the early rabbinic period, ascending to heaven. He is not ascending out of arrogance or curiosity. He is ascending to pray for the preservation of Israel. He has passed the dangerous guardians of the heavenly gates. He has reached the highest throne room. And there he is met by Metatron, who serves as his guide through the secrets of heaven. And Ishmael asks the question. He asks Metatron who he is. And Metatron's answer is the first great shock of the text. I am Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Kenan, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam. God took me from the generation of the flood and carried me up to the highest heavens on the wings of the Shekinah. Metatron is Enoch, the greatest angel in creation, the prince of the divine presence, the being who sits beside God's throne. He was once a man. He was once a mortal. He was once a human being who breathed air and walked on earth, and had a mother and a father, and a lineage stretching back to Adam. What does it mean that God chose a human being for this transformation? Why Enoch? And what exactly happened to him when he arrived? The transformation sequence is the heart of the text, and it is unlike anything else in ancient literature. It is not symbolic. It is not vague. It is precise, anatomical, and almost vertiginous in its ambition. When Enoch first arrives in heaven, he is clothed in light, the standard elevation of righteous humans in the heavenly realm. But this is only the beginning. God calls the heavenly princes together and announces what is about to happen. And then the transformation begins in earnest. First, Enoch's flesh is transformed. The text says that God made his flesh into torches of fire, not metaphorically, not in the sense of his skin glowing. His physical substance, the mortal flesh he brought with him from earth, becomes fire. The boundary between the organic and the elemental is dissolved. Then his bones. The third book of Enoch specifies that Enoch's bones become burning coals, gashalei esh, coals of fire. Again, the specificity is deliberate. This is not a general luminosity. This is a systematic replacement of the physical body, component by component, with substances of celestial fire. Then his eyes, they become torches of lightning, 2 sources of light blazing from the face, but still, unmistakably, eyes. The face is still there. The human shape is maintained, even as the human substance is replaced. But then comes the expansion. This is perhaps the most extraordinary moment in the entire transformation sequence, and it is the moment that most clearly reveals the theological stakes. God causes Enoch's height to expand until he spans the height of the world. The rabbis had a term for this cosmic scale. It is related to the concept of Adam Kadmon, the primordial Adam, whose body contained the universe. And now Enoch, seventh from Adam, achieves what Adam himself may have possessed before the fall: a body that is coextensive with creation. Think about what this means. A man who stood on earth, who had a height in feet and inches, who fit through doorways and sat at tables, is now a being whose presence fills the space between the lowest earth and the highest heaven. His scale has become cosmic. He does not merely dwell in heaven, he is the size of heaven. Why does scale matter so much in this transformation? What is the theological logic of a man who becomes as large as the universe? The logic is ancient and deep. In the cosmology that underlies 3 Enoch, the universe is structured around the divine throne, the Merkabah, the chariot throne of God that Ezekiel saw. The divine glory fills the universe. And the one who serves God most intimately, who stands closest to the throne, must somehow be commensurate with that glory. Metatron is not just an angel performing duties beside God. He is in some sense the embodiment of the created universe as it stands before its creator. Then come the attributes. After the physical transformation, Metatron is invested with the marks of his new authority. He is given 70 names. He is clothed in a garment of light, the specific light that God wore before he created the world. He is given a crown. He is seated on a throne beside God's throne, a throne that is specifically described as resembling the divine throne itself. And then, most staggeringly of all, God gives Metatron a name that appears nowhere else in heaven and has never been given to any other being. The lesser YHWH, the divine name itself, the sacred 4-letter name of God, YHWH, given to a created being with only the qualifier Ha-Katan, the lesser, to distinguish Metatron from God himself. 70 names. In Jewish tradition, 70 is the number of nations, the number of the elders of Israel, the number of the faces of Torah. It is the number of completeness in the realm of multiplicity, the number that says all of it, every kind, every direction, nothing left out. Metatron's 70 names are listed in the text, and they range from the mundane to the terrifying. Some are functional, names that describe his role as scribe, as judge, as steward of the heavenly archives. Some are regal, names that describe his crown and his throne and his authority over every principality and power in the created order. And some are names that blur the line between Metatron and God in ways that would have made any careful reader's breath catch. The name youth, Nar in Hebrew, is one of the most theologically interesting. In the Talmudic passages that predate 3 Enoch, Metatron is sometimes called the youth. Scholars have puzzled over this for generations. Why would the greatest being in creation be called the youth? One interpretation: he is the newest of the great heavenly beings, the most recently elevated, still young in comparison to the ancient principalities. Another interpretation: his youth marks him as the servant of the divine household, the one who runs the errands and keeps the records of the cosmic estate. But in 3 Enoch, this name acquires another resonance. He is young because he was once young, because he was once a human being who grew up, who had a childhood, who was once a boy named Enoch. His humanity is still present in his name, if you know how to read it. But the name that matters most, the name that makes everything else secondary, is the one we have already encountered, Yahoel, sometimes Yahoel, the name that contains within it the divine name itself. And then, most explicitly, Ha-Katan, the lesser, YHWH. What does it mean to bear God's own name? In the theology of the ancient world, bearing a name meant sharing in an essence. A name was not a label attached to an external reality. It was a window into the nature of the thing itself. For God to give Metatron his own name was to give Metatron something of his own being. Not his full being, hence Ha-Katan, the lesser, but something real, something that made the distinction between Metatron and God a distinction of degree rather than of kind. This is the most dangerous thing in the text, and the rabbis knew it. It is also the reason why the text includes a scene that might otherwise seem puzzling, the scene in which the angels challenge Metatron's authority. When Metatron is seated on his throne and crowned and invested with his names, the other angels react. The text describes the cosmic princes, the great angelic beings who have stood before God since before the creation of the world, as crying out in astonishment and something close to outrage. What is this? Why is there a being seated beside God? Why has a created being, a being who was once a mortal man, been given this throne and this crown and this name? And God answers them. God does not explain or justify. God simply declares, I have chosen him. I have elevated him. He bears my name. Whoever challenges him challenges me. The answer is pure authority. There is no philosophical argument, no theological justification, only the declaration of divine will. Metatron's authority is grounded not in his nature, not in his being inherently deserving, but in God's choice. This is, if you are reading carefully, a deeply interesting theological move. Metatron is not God. He is not equal to God, but he has been made, by divine choice, the representative of God's authority in all of creation. He is the face that creation sees when it looks toward the divine. He is the one through whom God acts in the world. Does any of this sound familiar? Scholars of early Christianity have been noting the parallels for over a century. The idea of a pre-existent divine agent who bears God's name, who sits at God's right hand, who mediates between God and creation. These are ideas that appear in the New Testament, in Pauline theology, in the Gospel of John, in the letter to the Hebrews. Jesus in Philippians 2 is given the name that is above every name. The Logos in John 1 is with God and is God, simultaneously distinct from and identified with the divine. The Son in Hebrews 1 reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature. Did the Metatron tradition influence early Christianity? Did it develop independently? Or did both traditions draw from the same deep well? From Second Temple Judaism's already existing tradition of divine agency, of beings who bore the divine name and acted as God's representatives? These questions do not have clean answers. What is clear is that the theological pattern is ancient, and that 3 Enoch represents its fullest, most systematic articulation in Jewish literature. The man who became God's throne, the human being who was chosen to bear the divine name and sit beside the divine presence. And it is at this point, at the moment of Metatron's fullest authority, enthroned and crowned and bearing the name of God, that we must tell the story of Acher, The Talmud tells us that 4 great sages entered the Pardes, the orchard, the garden, the realm of mystical speculation and ascent. Their names were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Zoma looked and was stricken. Acher looked and cut the shoots, a phrase whose precise meaning has been debated for centuries, but which clearly indicates a kind of spiritual severance, a departure from the tradition. Only Akiva entered in peace and departed in peace. The Third Book of Enoch places Acher, Elisha ben Avuya, in heaven at the moment when Metatron is seated on his throne. And the text is precise about what he saw and what he concluded. He saw Metatron seated, crowned, enthroned beside God. He saw the being who bore the divine name, whose throne resembled the divine throne, whose authority extended over all of creation. And he said, "Perhaps there are 2 powers in heaven." In Jewish theology of the rabbinic period, there was no more dangerous statement. The foundational declaration of Judaism, Shema Yisrael, YHWH Eloheinu, YHWH Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, was understood not merely as a statement about monotheism, but as a wall against precisely this kind of thinking. 2 powers, 2 divine thrones, 2 sources of ultimate authority. The heresy that the rabbis called 2 powers in heaven was one of their central polemical targets. It appeared in various forms, in Gnostic traditions, in certain Christian theologies, in philosophical dualism of various kinds. The rabbis fought it obsessively. They guarded against it in their interpretations of Scripture. They warned their students away from textual passages that might be read as implying a second divine principle. And then they wrote a text in which their greatest mystic ascended to heaven, saw a being seated beside God on a throne like God's throne, bearing God's own name, and concluded exactly what the rabbis had been warning against for centuries. What are we supposed to make of this? This is the question that has made the Acher incident so endlessly fascinating to scholars and theologians. The rabbis used his story as a warning. Come close to the Merkabah, and you risk ending up like Acher. You risk seeing something that you cannot accommodate, that your tradition cannot hold, that breaks you rather than illuminates you. But the story cuts in more than one direction. Because what exactly did Acher see that was wrong? He saw what 3 Enoch describes. He saw Metatron. And his conclusion, there are 2 powers, seems, from within the frame of 3 Enoch itself, almost like the reasonable response to what he saw. The text goes to considerable lengths to establish Metatron's extraordinary authority and divine-like status. The lesser YHWH language, the divine throne, the divine name, these are all in the text. The problem, from the rabbinic perspective, is not that Acher saw something false. The problem is that he drew the wrong metaphysical conclusion from something real. Metatron's authority is delegated, not inherent. His exaltation is God's choice, not his own nature. He is seated beside God's throne, not on it. He is the lesser YHWH, not YHWH itself. The distinction is real, but it is also extraordinarily fine. And it requires a framework, an ability to hold together the simultaneous claims of cosmic authority and creaturely dependence that Acher apparently could not maintain. In 3 Enoch's version of the incident, God's response to Acher's conclusion is striking. God does not correct Acher's theology directly. Instead, God commands the angel Anaphil to strike Metatron, to punish Metatron with 60 lashes of fire, as a demonstration that Metatron is a servant, not an equal. The lashes are not punishment for anything Metatron has done wrong. They are a theological correction aimed at Acher, a demonstration that even the being on the second throne can be disciplined like any other created entity. Does this work as a theological response? Does seeing an angel punished actually prove that the angel is not divine? Acher, apparently, remained unconvinced. The Talmudic tradition tells us that he went on to apostatize, to leave the tradition, to study Greek philosophy, to spend time among the Romans, to encourage students to abandon Torah. He became Acher the other, a name that effaces his identity while preserving his apostasy. The rabbis refused to even quote him by name in many contexts. But here is the thing that should make us pause. The rabbis preserved his story, they told it and retold it, they included the Acher incident in the Talmud, in the Hekhalot literature, in 3 Enoch itself. Why? One answer: as a warning. Do not ascend, do not speculate. The celestial throne room is dangerous. What Acher saw broke him. Let his brokenness be a lesson. Another answer: as a testament. Because even within the warning, Acher saw something. He saw Metatron. He saw what Enoch became. And his conclusion, however wrong its metaphysical framing, was a response to something real. The tradition preserved his story because his story confirmed that the tradition's own most radical claims were true. Metatron is there, the throne is there, the man who became an angel is seated in heaven. And if that is enough to break a great sage, what does it say about what the tradition is actually describing? The question we need to sit with here is not simply historical, it is structural. It is about how traditions relate to their own edges, their own extremes, the places where their own logic, followed to its conclusion, produces something that threatens the tradition itself. Third Enoch has never been lost. It was preserved, copied, studied by mystics and Kabbalists in medieval and early modern Jewish communities. Hugo Odeberg produced the first major Western critical edition in 1928. Philip Alexander translated it for the landmark collection, the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, edited by James Charlesworth in 1983. The text exists. It is accessible. You can read it. But it has never been part of mainstream Jewish or Christian religious education. It is not read in synagogues. It is not taught in Sunday schools. It is not in the religious literacy of the average educated believer. And this is not because it is obscure in the way that, say, a fragmentary papyrus from Egypt is obscure. It is obscure because the institutions responsible for transmitting religious knowledge chose, collectively and over centuries, to transmit other things instead. Why? Part of the answer is canonical. Third Enoch was never included in any canonical scripture, not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Christian Old Testament, not in any broadly authoritative collection. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes First Enoch in its Bible, which is why First Enoch survives complete. But Third Enoch was never that lucky, or, depending on your perspective, never that dangerous to the authorities who controlled the canon. Part of the answer is the nature of Hekhalot literature itself. The heavenly ascent texts, including Third Enoch, were understood within the tradition as esoteric, as suited only for scholars of great learning and spiritual maturity. The Mishnah tractate Haggadah explicitly warns against teaching the mysteries of the Merkabah to any but the most qualified students. The heavenly chariot, Maaseh Merkabah, is not to be expounded in the presence of a single student, unless he is a sage and already understands the matter on his own. The texts themselves were understood as potentially dangerous to unprepared minds, as the Acher incident confirmed. But there is a deeper reason than canonicity or esotericism. And to see it, we need to look at what Third Enoch claims and what that claim threatens. Third Enoch claims that a human being became the second most powerful entity in the universe. It claims that this transformation is not mythological, not symbolic, not a poetic amplification. It is an account of what actually happened. Flesh became fire. A man became a throne. A mortal became, in some sense, divine. This claim exists in profound tension with the central concern of rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple. That central concern was the absolute, uncompromised, non-negotiable unity and uniqueness of God. The entire rabbinic project, the system of law, of prayer, of study, of daily practice, was constructed as a response to the loss of the temple, as an alternative means of maintaining covenant with a God who was singular and transcendent and unlike anything in creation. A text that describes a human being becoming the lesser YHWH, seated on a throne beside God, bearing God's name. This text strains against that project. It does not contradict it directly. The rabbis who wrote and preserved Third Enoch were not heretics. They maintained the crucial distinction between Metatron as creature and God as creator. But they were exploring a territory where that distinction becomes very, very thin. And in a tradition preoccupied with the dangers of that territory, as the Acher story confirmed, the wisest institutional response was to keep the text available, but not prominent, to let it exist in the hands of the qualified without putting it in the hands of the general community. Christianity, meanwhile, had its own reasons for ignoring Third Enoch. Christian theology had already developed its own account of the divine human, the celestial intermediary who bears God's name and sits at God's right hand. That account was centered on Jesus. A Jewish text claiming that the prototype for this kind of figure was not the Messiah, but a pre-Mosaic patriarch, that the divine human enthroned in heaven was Enoch, served no institutional purpose in Christian contexts. The parallel was too close to be comfortable and too different to be useful. So, the text survived. In Kabbalistic traditions, Metatron remained a significant figure, appearing in the Zohar, in mystical diagrams, in the lore of angel magic and divine mediation, but always at the margins, always for specialists, always with the implicit understanding that this was not material for general circulation, until now. Let me be very direct about something before we close. The Third Book of Enoch is not a metaphor. The rabbis who wrote it were not writing poetry. They believed, or at the very least were describing a tradition that believed, that what the text describes actually happened, that Enoch walked into heaven, that his flesh became fire, that he was given 70 names and seated on a cosmic throne, that the being who stands beside God's throne in the highest heaven was once a human being who breathed and walked and lived. This is not a comfortable claim. It is not comfortable for mainstream Judaism, which has generally preferred to emphasize the absolute difference between God and all created things, including the most exalted human beings. It is not comfortable for most versions of Christianity, which has its own account of the divine human that leaves no room for an alternative claimant. It is not comfortable for secular readers, who may find the cosmology strange. But it is a claim with extraordinary resonance, and I want to try to articulate why. What does it mean that the tradition's answer to the question of human destiny is transformation rather than dissolution? In many religious traditions, the relationship between the human and the divine is managed through radical difference. The human is finite, mortal, limited, sinful, earthly. The divine is infinite, eternal, unlimited, perfect, celestial. And the best that the human can hope for is to be received into the presence of the divine, welcomed, perhaps forgiven, perhaps blessed, while remaining essentially what it was, human, other, looking at the divine from the outside. Third, Enoch refuses this. It says, the human can become, not become God, the lesser. YHWH is still the lesser, but become something so close to the divine that the difference is a difference of role and origin, not of nature. The fire that fills Metatron's bones is the same fire that fills the celestial realm. The name that blazes on his crown contains the divine name. He sits on a throne that resembles God's throne. The Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition has a concept for this: theosis, deification. The idea that the purpose of human life is not merely to obey God, but to become like God, to participate in the divine nature, as the letter of Peter puts it. The great theologians of Orthodox Christianity, Athanasius, Maximus the Confessor, Gregory Palamas, developed this idea into a sophisticated theology of human transformation. God became human so that humans might become divine. What is extraordinary about Third Enoch is that it offers a Jewish version of this theology, one that predates or runs parallel to Christian theosis, one that is rooted in the same ancient Jewish soil, and one that is in some ways even more radical. Because in Third Enoch, the deified human is not the Son of God who descends. He is the son of Adam who ascends. He is the human being who arrives at the destination toward which the tradition pointed from the very beginning. The walking with God that began in the garden, that Enoch took further than anyone, that leads eventually to the second throne of heaven. What does the Acher incident teach us about the danger of this knowledge? We said earlier that the Acher incident cuts in two directions, that it is simultaneously a warning against speculation and a testament to the reality of what the speculation is about. Let me suggest a third reading. Acher broke. He saw Metatron enthroned, and he could not hold what he saw within the framework of his tradition. He concluded there were two powers. He left. He became the other. But consider, he was not wrong that he had seen something. He was not wrong that the something he saw demanded a response. His error, if it was an error, was in the framework he chose for understanding it. He translated a vision of cosmic delegation into a vision of cosmic dualism. He saw a throne and concluded there was a second God, rather than a servant of God, exalted beyond all other servants. And the question that Third Enoch implicitly poses is, what would it have taken for him to hold the vision without breaking? What kind of framework would have allowed him to see Metatron enthroned and return to earth with his faith not just intact but deepened? The answer, I think, is the answer that Third Enoch itself is attempting to provide. The framework that allows you to hold this vision is the one that understands human transformation, not as a threat to divine sovereignty, but as its highest expression. God does not lose authority when God elevates Enoch. God demonstrates authority, the authority to remake what was made, to elevate what was humble, to bring the finite into proximity with the infinite without dissolving the distinction between them. Acker's tragedy is not that he saw too much. It is that he saw too much for the framework he was using. And the tragedy is compounded because the framework he needed was, in a sense, already in the tradition he left. Why has this been kept from almost everyone? I want to answer this question differently from how I framed it in Part 5. Because the suppression of Third Enoch is not simply an institutional failure or a calculated management of dangerous ideas. It is also, I think, a kind of honesty. The tradition knew that this text was powerful. It knew that power could harm as well as illuminate. The Acker story was not invented to scare people away. It was preserved because it was true. People do break when they encounter the edges of the tradition's claims about God and humanity and the distance between them. And so the decision to keep Third Enoch at the margins was, in part, a decision to protect people from a vision they might not be ready for. The tradition offered other entry points: prayer, study, law, community, narrative, that led toward the same ultimate reality without the vertigo of a direct encounter with the enthroned Enoch. But we are here now, and we have walked through the text. And I want to end with the image that the text itself keeps returning to. Not the fire, not the throne, not the names, the face. When the transformation is complete, when Enoch's flesh has become fire and his bones have become coal and his height has filled the cosmos and his names have blazed in the air above the heavenly throne room. The text describes Metatron's face. And what it says is this: the face is like the face of the sun. It shines with a light that fills the highest heaven. But it is still a face. It is still, barely recognizably, a human face. The fire does not erase the face. The cosmic scale does not dissolve the features. The 70 names do not replace the identity. Metatron, the Prince of the Divine Presence, the lesser YHWH, the second throne of heaven, is still Enoch, is still the man who walked with God, is still the seventh from Adam. And that, I think, is the most extraordinary thing in the entire text. Not the transformation, but what the transformation preserves. The tradition is saying something very specific when it insists that Metatron's face is still recognizably human. It is saying that what God elevated, God did not destroy. That the human being who arrived in heaven arrived as a human being and remained a human being, even as he became something no human being had ever been. That the path from earth to the second throne of heaven does not require the erasure of what you were. It requires the perfection of it. This is the most radical claim in the tradition, more radical than the fire, more radical than the throne, more radical than the name. The claim that humanity, finite, mortal, earthborn, Adam-descended humanity, is not an obstacle to the divine. It is, when walked with God all the way to the end, the very thing God chooses to seat beside himself. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, and God took him. And this, in all of this, is what that means. The Third Book of Enoch is available in Philip Alexander's translation in James Charlesworth's Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, Volume 1. Hugo Odeberg's 1928 critical edition remains a foundational scholarly resource. For the broader tradition of Hekhalot and Merkabah mysticism, Peter Schaeffer's work is essential, particularly The Origins of Jewish Mysticism and his critical edition of the Hekhalot literature. Rachel Elior's The Three Temples provides a different and challenging perspective on the relationship between priestly tradition and early Jewish mysticism. For the Enoch tradition as a whole, Andrei Orlov's scholarship is indispensable. His work on the Enoch Metatron tradition and dark mirrors, Azazel and Satanael in early Jewish demonology, place Third Enoch within its full context, in ways that repay careful reading. If you've made it to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of material that rewards patience. The tradition we've been following across this series did not produce these texts for a casual audience. Neither did we. If this is your first video in the series, the full trajectory, Genesis to First Enoch, to Second Enoch, to Third Enoch, is there in the back catalog. Each text adds something. Each step of the transformation makes more sense with the previous steps behind you. And if there is a text, a figure, a tradition you want us to follow into the depths, the comments are there. We read them. Next time. The tradition doesn't end with Third Enoch. It circles back. And when we look at the Merkabah tradition from the vantage point of everything we now know about Metatron, the entire history of Jewish mysticism looks different. See you then.